Hi, this is Tom Broussard. It's Tuesday, April 6th. Nice to see everybody. Today's title is Stroke and Aphasia Recovery, Metaphors Help Us Mend, that provide the hidden similar between the two. Oftentimes, they are quite different, but they still end up looking the same, and that's what a metaphor does. You learn an awful lot based on the comparing the two and looking for those hidden similarities. In my particular case, I've told you this many times, after my stroke, I spent a lot of time thinking through what was wrong and how I would get better. And soon after, since I found out that X number of cells were destroyed, I assumed that that also meant that some number of words would also be gone. You know, I didn't know how the brain works. I don't know how they file that information, but I assumed that there were words or word entities that were destroyed as well. So I went looking, walking, looking the world around me, looking for items that somehow buses, cars, trees, stores, signs, churches, schools, libraries, you name it. I could see things. There were some things I had a hard time coming up with the word. Skylines, skyscrapers. I couldn't find those words, but I knew what they were. And somewhere deep in my head, I could say those words, but I couldn't pronounce them or write them down. But they were still there. And that was me beginning to understand that when I lost all those cells, it wasn't that I lost those entities. So somehow the brain must be built with the language, not with individual words, but actually very small pieces and parts that build up into the words or sentences and so forth. So again, I've told you this before, thinking about my past, I was a shipbuilder for a long time, and I thought that shipbuilders, all of us, built up these big, beautiful ships of steel, but we all start from the very beginning with very small pieces and parts. We actually had drawings that were called pieces and parts. And we would build them up, what became sub-assemblies and sub-units and then units, and then you end up with what turns out to be a ship. But metaphorically, on the inside, and any number of other things that you build big things, sending all kinds of material to space, you still start at the very beginning with small pieces. And I thought that maybe my language was not unlike building ships, building off of these incredibly small pieces and parts, and then building them up into words. And the more I considered that, and then began to read more about it, I began to understand that's exactly the way the brain works, using these incredibly small components, but it does have all this capacity because it has trillions of synapses and other neuro matter. When you're talking about trillions, pretty much anything we're doing, including this conversation, you listening to my conversation, me talking to you, you listening, and both of us understanding together how we are even considering this particular metaphor or any number of other things, and we begin to see, oh, that's because we have new additional neuro matter such that you have more capacity to do today what you couldn't do yesterday, or more this minute than you couldn't do a minute ago, because of the way metaphors and other stimulus that comes as a result of the therapy or informal therapy that people with aphasia can do, realizing that pretty much anything that we do continues to create this capacity to do more tomorrow based on what we're doing today. So those pieces and parts turned out to be scattered because the brain is also highly redundant. So it's not like you had one particular place damaged and that was the end of it, even though in my case it was in the Broca's area. It isn't that all of our, quote, words were lodged, were filed, were sitting there such that the damage to them happens to hit everything that could see right here. That isn't the case at all. The brain is highly redundant, and it is highly scattered across the networks that we have, such that when the damage hits here, it really hits the individual pieces and parts that are scattered around the brain, and quote, hitting them in such a way that because they're so redundant, have more or less damage, so that they provide more or less damage to one of the built up components that would have been words that I could no longer pronounce. But because there's enough voting with enough of those redundant networks that one of them more damaged than others, they're still voting, such that they're voting for that word. And the more you work on that word or that idea or those thoughts, the more they will vote more going forward based on doing the activity of considering them. I mean, that's what plasticity does. I mean, it converts thought and cognitive activity into neuromatter. So again, having our conversation right now, realizing that even metaphors helps you mend, because metaphors provide you with more, I'll say, more work, and have to work harder to better understand what is it that, in this case, this metaphor is talking about, and can you, meaning you, come up with other metaphors with which, based on your experience in your past, that can help you better understand it. And as a result of better understanding it, you are then becoming more capable of understanding, because while you're having that process happening right now in your brain, it is building more dendrites and synapses, more of that neuro matter. So it's highly recursive also, because the more you do, the more you do. So it is very, very interesting. And I'm just using my shipbuilding metaphor just as one of many that others can use. I just happen to use it a lot, and you see it in a lot of my articles. And all of my articles and all of my thoughts really come from, like I say, in my case, 69 years of life before my stroke. You do remember things, and you can go back and study your past, looking for the lessons you had learned prior to your stroke, and understanding that those lessons helped you, and now finding that you can use those same as how you can continue to get better. Using metaphors is a really good example, because they do provide additional stimulus that allows, based on the stimulus, to build more pieces and parts, as it were, whether they be ships or neuromatter. That is what they are doing. And for the most part, depending on severity, those words aren't lost totally. Although I do know, and plenty of my friends are still working their way through this for sure, building up enough ability to express what they want to say, even in sometimes the most simplest of words. So I do understand severity and several other components still makes it more difficult for you to find those particular words going forward. But the more you do consider metaphors as an example, or any other stimulus, the harder you work at it, it actually does provide you with more tools. Even if those tools are these little pieces and parts, they're built that way. They are built to learn or repair. And the more you consider all of this, I know it's somewhat interesting, because you consider these things, and you read as best you can, hear as best you can, speak as best you can. It doesn't matter how bad it is. What matters is the activity themselves. It is the activity themselves that allows the brain to basically wake up and say, oh, I should do this. Even if it's wrong, it is doing it. And all those other redundant networks who are more or less damaged, they all can see, quote, see, and can contribute to the others who need more help, as it were, based on, again, the way the brain works. And because there are trillions. You know, we talk about millions, we talk about billions. Now we get into trillions, and that allows, and it's highly adaptive. So it isn't like you have trillions and that's where they stay. Because of the way the brain is worked, it is always in the process of descending or ascending in terms of its day-to-day, moment-to-moment capacity. And the more you provide the stimulus, go up. If you stop, it will come down. All of it will come down because it's always moving all the time, up and down, up and down. So the more of the stimulus you do, it will continue to go up. And the more you do it, of course, it will actually stay there. If you don't do anything, yes, eventually it will come back down. But again, because of the way the brain is works, that the more and more of those synapses and those trillions of synapses fire, then the more they do that, the more they etch the memory in our brain. So the more you do that, the more it wants to do that. It's building a neuro habit of holding on to that information. And the longer it stays there, the longer it will stay there. And yes, you can forget some things, but the truth is, you and I both, when we think about who you were when you were a kid, you remember those things. Even if you haven't thought about it for a long time, the more you think about it, or your family, your mom, your dad, where you live, you begin to understand and remember something that was never forgotten. And of course, we do forget lots of things, but they probably weren't all that important when we forgot them. So it does really etch into the brain in that particular way with new mental muscles, and they'll hold on as best they can going forward. So I do appreciate that metaphors, as well as any number of other stimulus that is needed for the brain to, quote, get better, as well as those who haven't had a stroke, but they need to learn something new, like calculus. It takes a lot of work, but the more you work on it, the more you'll get better going forward. Excuse me. And it allows each activity you do to handle more cognitive activities going forward, and the resultant learning that comes as a result of that. As I say, the work I've been doing, basically trying to understand what was, quote, wrong with me and how I could get better, and then trying to now, 10 years later, able to express that and articulate enough for all of you, all of us, with our own stroke and our own language deficits. It allows, hopefully, you to better understand how your brain works for all of us as we go forward, how each of our brains work for each of us going forward. And in my particular case, given the, and I am now able to communicate and speak, which I could not do before. And again, I continue to be lucky because I did save all that evidence, so you can actually see that, oh, this guy Tom, he never had any problem. Well, because I saved it, because I kept that diary and I recorded myself, you can understand that this is the way it works for all of us. We can get better as long as we understand how the brain works. Nice to see everybody. I will see you again in 2 weeks, and it's getting to be spring, so we're looking forward to that. Thank you very much. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.